Hello, everyone, and welcome to the McLean County Community Behavioral Health Forum on this extremely cold day. We are happy to have you with us this afternoon. My name is Kevin McCall, and I'm a behavioral health specialist with the McLean County government, and I will be standing in for the Behavioral Health Coordinating Council Supervisor, Tricia Malott, who could not be with us today. The McLean County Community Behavioral Health Forum is typically a one-day event consisting of multiple breakout sessions. With the ongoing global pandemic, we have adapted our in-person format and are pleased to offer a wide variety of individual sessions related to behavioral health that will be offered through April of 2021. Please check out our website for a full listing of these sessions, which include topics such as COVID-19, youth mental health, coping strategies, and much, much more. All registration is completely free, and you can even register on the same day. Sessions are held at varying times to allow for maximum participation by community members, but all presentations are actually uploaded to the McLean County Behavioral Health YouTube page, so you can watch those at a later date if you can't be in attendance. I will provide links for both our website and our YouTube page in the chat located on your sidebar. I would like to encourage you to check back there regularly for new additions as we continue to add speakers for topics outlined by our planning committee. We hope you'll continue to join us for the next several months as we continue to offer these sessions. Even with the new look this year, the idea of a free community education and sharing of ideas originated out of the Mental Health Action Plan, which was adopted by the 2015 McLean County Board. This plan originated out of more than 100 community members that identified needs and best practices related to behavioral health specific to McLean County. In these uncertain and difficult times, we believe that it is more important than ever to help provide education, resources, and encouragement, or even simply recognition of life's challenges. During today's presentation, there will be time at the end for questions. We ask that if you choose to ask a question during the presentation, that you provide enough context so that questions can be appropriately answered by our speaker at the end. At this time, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Keith Brotheridge. Keith Brotheridge is a licensed clinical social worker with over 25 years of experience who has devoted much of his career to helping those impacted by trauma. Mr. Brotheridge has worked at the Baby Fold, an agency providing special education, adoption support, foster care programming, and numerous other services to children and families. Since 2009, serving as the therapy supervisor and assistant director of the Residential Treatment Center for the first 8 years of his career there. Currently, as training coordinator, Mr. Brotheridge is tasked with performing trauma-informed training and consultation to the entire agency to ensure that all programs operate in a trauma-sensitive manner. Mr. Brotheridge has also provided a wide range of trauma-informed trainings to various schools and agencies across the central Illinois area. Prior to coming to the Baby Fold, Mr. Brotheridge spent 15 years as a therapist, clinical manager, and site director at Family Service of Northwest Ohio, where he worked extensively with children and families impacted by the trauma of domestic violence. He was also a founding board member of the Cocoon, a battered women's shelter in Wood County, Ohio. Mr. Brotheridge is a trained practitioner in trust-based relational intervention, or TBRI, a trauma educational model developed by Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross at Texas Christian University. He is also trained as a master trainer of adverse childhood experiences, and he has delivered trauma trainings nationally for cross-country education focused on treatment and recovery of traumatized youth and using trauma-informed approaches within schools. Throughout his career, Mr. Brotheridge has presented at local and regional community forums and workshops. He has also taught social work and psychology courses at 2 community colleges in Northwest Ohio. Mr. Brotheridge attained his master's in clinical social work from the Ohio State University. Without further ado, Mr. Keith Brotheridge.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that introduction. I am hopeful that you all can hear me and that you can see my screen. I'm going to go on that assumption unless I hear otherwise. And as the introduction suggested, I am going to focus the next 50 minutes or so talking about adverse childhood experiences, or the ACE study, as some may have heard of it. So before jumping into the adverse childhood experiences, the study, There. I wanted to ground us, and I have a tendency to do this when I do trainings. I wanted to ground us with a quote. And again, oh, sorry. And Mr. Rogers, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, as many of you probably have. And I really like this quote. Although some of it's blocked from my screen, I will try to get through it. When I was a boy and I would see scary thing in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. To this day, especially in times of disaster, I remember my mother's words, and I am always comforted by realizing that there are still so many helpers, so many caring people in the world. And I just think this is a wonderful quote to ground us. And we're going to talk about trauma, obviously, in the next 50, 60 minutes. But one thing I would like to say, and Mr. Rogers was onto something here, the number one buffer to any traumatic experience is relationships and social connection. And so as Mr. Rogers is telling us, there are helpers in the world. It's really those helpers that we can rely on to help us through trauma in any way, shape, or form. I also want to ground us in just a definition of trauma, because that's the ACE study and the Adverse Childhood Experiences study is obviously measuring the amount of trauma in some way, shape, or form on our lives, in our lives. And so this definition, trauma results from an event, which is one of 3 E's when we talk about trauma. We talk about an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has long lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, social, emotional, physical, spiritual well-being. So you've got these 3 E's of trauma. You've got an event, whatever that event may be. You have a very individualized experience of the event and individual effects of the event, depending on what the event is. And I just want to share with folks who may be on now, we've been going through a shared traumatic event for the past year in terms of COVID-19. We've all, when I say all, the world has been impacted by this traumatic event and the stress that this traumatic event has put on all of us. But even if I talk about this shared world trauma of COVID, all of us experience that event differently and have been experiencing it differently in the past year, very individualized, and the effects upon us are very different depending on our situations. I also want to just raise the awareness of the big T and little t trauma idea. Big T traumas, these are the ones that stop you in your tracks. And I would suggest to those on here today, we've been living through a big T trauma and continue to with COVID-19. That is not a little t trauma. When I think of little t's, kind of smaller traumas, maybe it's a little fender bender we get into running errands in the car. No major injuries, certainly shaken up, no major damage. That would be a little t trauma. A big T trauma, kind of reflecting off of that, would be a major car accident with injuries, life-threatening injuries. That's a big T trauma. So I want folks to have an understanding that we do have these big T traumas in our lives. We also have these little t traumas at various points in our life too. And some important concepts before diving into the ACE study and the adverse childhood experiences background. We have to understand all trauma is a subjective experience. And I just mentioned it's responded to very differently by everyone because traumatic events, there's individualized meaning when we are confronted with them. And some basic life assumptions are shattered when we are impacted by big T trauma. And I could argue that if we look at the example of the shared world trauma, COVID-19, certainly these life assumptions get called into question for many over the past year and for the months to come. The world is generally a safe place. Big T trauma has a tendency to negate that, to alter that feeling that the world is a safe place. And for many of us, the world isn't all that safe in regards to COVID-19. And we've seen that the past 11 months. And again, one of those basic life assumptions that is shattered is that people are generally good, especially if trauma is being perpetrated by other people. It certainly calls into question, are people really good or not? Are people to be trusted or not? And again, when we experience a big T trauma in any way, shape, or form in our life, it really shatters this perception that we are generally in control of our lives. After a traumatic event, going through COVID for the past 10, 11 months, it really calls into question how much of my life am I in control of in some way, shape, or form. So those basic life assumptions become shattered. And trauma, especially big T trauma, overwhelms our resources internally to be able to respond in adaptive ways, to move beyond the trauma. I want to mention toxic stress. Toxic stress can cause similar effects to big T traumas in our lives. And I know one question that I often get is, well, what are some toxic stresses that we can be impacted by? And I put a few examples here in parentheses. Certainly living in poverty, the impact of racism on a daily basis is a toxic stress. Chronic bullying for those children who have to put up with that on a daily basis in school or outside of school. Those are toxic stresses that have kind of a day in and day out dose of trauma in people's lives. And traumas, certainly big T traumas, as I've already described, and high amounts of toxic stress lead to what we call survival versus learning mode. And that has a lot to do with where we are in our brains. Are we in our upstairs brain or are we in our downstairs brain? One thing we have to understand is when we're born, the lower brain is the most developed. And in the first several years of life, the brain grows from bottom to top and from inside out. And the learning mode part of our brain is up at the top. And so when we have children who've gone through a lot of trauma in early childhood, what we find is they have a more difficult time getting to the upstairs brain because of how their brain is connected and how their brain has been impacted by trauma. And we see some functional and structural brain problems as a result of a tremendous amount of trauma in childhood. There are certain parts of the brain that actually, in children who've been traumatized in childhood, that their brains are actually, or these parts of their brains are actually 8 to 10% smaller than children who weren't traumatized. So trauma restructures how the brain develops, and in some way, shapes, and forms, this can be problematic. And so what's the prevalence of childhood trauma? The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, I would recommend that as a website for a whole host of information on trauma, specifically childhood trauma, resources for caregivers, teachers, professionals. It really is a great website and place to look for information. And research shows out of hundreds of agencies that are hooked into the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, 25% of school-going children are exposed to a traumatic event, like physical or sexual abuse, abandonment, neglect, death of a loved one, violence, accidents, bullying, or living in chronically chaotic environments. 25% are impacted by a host of trauma. 1 in 4 kids. To me, that prevalence is really high. And so with that as a backdrop, I just wanted to focus the rest of our time and present you a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study and what that study showed, some of the results and the implications from that study. And first, let me share just a little bit about what was this study? Where did it come from? As you can see on this particular slide, there were 2 investigators that pooled their resources together. Dr. Robert Anda, who is an epidemiologist, and at the time he worked for the Centers of Disease Control, the CDC. And Dr. Vincent Folletti was a general practitioner doctor in Southern California. And for years, he had actually been working on the issue, the physical issue of obesity, and running groups for obese persons in hopes of figuring out how to lose weight, how to not be obese. And as Dr. Vincent Folletti was running these treatment groups on obesity, what he found over the course of time was, yes, most, if not all of these folks could lose weight. But what he also noticed was 99% of the time, after they lost weight, they put it back on, and sometimes more weight back on. And it just got Dr. Vincent Folletti, as he described it, thinking about there's something going on here beyond the obesity. And even his mind went to trauma in childhood. And that's what really motivated Dr. Vincent Folletti to join up with Dr. Robert Anda to really get a sense of how people are impacted by childhood trauma. And so working with the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, which Dr. Vincent Folletti worked for, a health maintenance organization, the largest in Southern California. Over this particular study was started in the mid-90s, 94, and it's the largest longitudinal study of its kind with over 17,000 study participants. And it went on for years. They're still looking at data, and they're following some of these participants into their, older life years. And as you'll see, they just want to get a sense of physical health outcomes as well as mental health outcomes of adults who had a lot of childhood adversity. And what the ACE study confirms, and we'll see this as we go through the slides, that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. And in particular, a whole host of physical problems that we'll talk about as well. So these 17,000 study participants actually came from regular doctor's appointments over the course of years in Southern California. So if anybody went in for a doctor's appointment to their general practitioner or a medical center, they would be given a 10-question survey. And those 10 questions asked about different household traumas that folks may have experienced in childhood. And if they experienced any of the 10, they would put a check mark next to it and basically add up the scores. And so what were those 10 questions that they were asking about in this study? Well, the survey, it was just one sheet, 10 questions, and essentially it was asking, growing up experiencing any of the following 10 conditions in the household prior to the age of 18. And it's not just one instance of emotional abuse, for instance, that they were asking. I think the language that they used within the survey was, did you frequently experience? Did you frequently experience? But as you can see from this slide, they were trying to get a sense of emotional abuse, physical and sexual abuse in childhood, emotional and physical neglect in childhood, growing up in a violent home, witnessing domestic violence, growing up with a caregiver who was an alcoholic or substance abuser, growing up and for a period of time, one of your caregiver's parents were incarcerated, loss of a parent, death certainly in childhood, losing a parent through death. But what this was really getting at too was divorce. Did your parents divorce when you were under the age of 18? And finally, mental illness, suicidal household member, growing up with a caregiver or parent who was mentally ill, who was suicidal. These were the 10 conditions that they looked at. And these are often called household traumas, household dysfunction, because these traumas occur, or at least what they were measuring, what happened in the home you grew up in, essentially. And again, I have at the bottom of the slide, and if we were in person, I'd be asking folks this and just getting some input from the audience. Here are 10 traumas that are listed out, but what are the other traumas that we can experience in childhood that are not on this list in any way, shape, or form? I already talked about car accidents. Certainly children can live through those. Children can live through natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, fires. Those are all traumas. So again, I will also note community violence is certainly a trauma that many kids have to grow up with depending on where they live in the environment and community they live in. That's not on the list. I would argue that going hungry or living in poverty is a daily trauma, and that's not on the list. So the point here is the ACE study is just looking at 10 household traumas. There are a lot of other traumas we are impacted by as well in childhood. And I think that makes the kind of the outcomes of the ACE study even more important to me. Because again, it's showing that we are impacted as a country by a lot of trauma, but it's not even taking into account all of the other traumatic experiences we can be subjected to outside of the household. But we'll talk about that in a minute. And so if you were to take this 10-question survey, we would all have an ACE score. And essentially, it's adding up the total number of points that you checked yes to on the 10-question survey. So an ACE score of 0 means that a person reported no exposure to any of those 10 categories of trauma that were listed on the previous slide. And an ACE score of 10 means that the person reported exposure in all categories, all 10 of those categories that we talked about on the previous slide. And this slide here shows out of 17,000 participants, how did these scores break down? And as you can see, 33% of the 17,000 participants reported no childhood ACEs, and that's fantastic. A third of that amount of study participants reporting no ACEs. When I do this training, I always point out the realities of, I think that 33% who reported 0 ACEs is probably high. It's a high percentage, and let me tell you why, and I ground this in my experience that was introduced in my bio at the beginning. I spent 15 years working with domestic violence offenders, male batterers in Northwest Ohio. I worked with hundreds of male batterers. No surprise in regards to many of those men that I worked with, the majority of those men that I worked with would not have defined their childhood. They wouldn't have defined physical abuse as physical abuse. They wouldn't have seen that being whipped daily by their father or being slammed up against a wall was physical abuse. And why am I sharing this? Because I think some people probably completed the survey, had 0 ACEs, when in reality they probably did have 1 or 2 ACEs. They just didn't define physical or emotional abuse as physical or emotional abuse. I think at the other end of the continuum here, you see 10% reported having 3 ACEs in childhood, and 16% reported 4 or more. That's 26% of folks that reported 3 or more ACEs. And that's important to understand, because as the ACE score goes up, so does the risk of physical health problems, as this study showed us. And we'll get into that on the next slide. And again, this is another slide that just shows how and what the percentages of how the scores were broken down with each of the 10 questions. So how many of these participants grew up with a substance abusing caregiver? 27%. To me, that's certainly a high number. As you look at these percentages, it won't take you long to figure out that, well, wait a second, these all add up to more than 100%. And you are correct. What we know about 1 ACE is often 1 ACE in childhood comes along with 2 or 3. If you have a caregiver who's emotionally abusive, sometimes they're physically abusive. Or if you have a caregiver who's physically abusive, oftentimes there is emotional abuse as well. So these ACEs don't just come in one by one, they're often in pairs. And certainly with one comes the chances of others, depending on the household. I like showing some of the impact that we see, at least within the schools, with children with high ACE scores. And as you can see from this slide, if our baseline is a child with no known ACEs, what happens when their ACE score goes up to 1, to 2, and then 3 or more ACEs? And as you can see, profoundly and exponentially, the rates of attendance problems, behavior problems, academic problems, and health problems go up with each added ACE score. And so what this is telling me is, as our ACE score gets higher, we are at more risk, or we have children, school-age children, are at more risk for these 4 problem sets, whether it's attendance, behavior, academic, or health. And some of the general findings from the ACE study, and again, this was from the mid-1990s through just, I believe, the 2014, 2015, some of the results that have come out of this is that ACEs are the best predictor of drug use in adult women. High ACE scores can almost be a predictor for drug use at some point in adult women's lives. What we know about sex, high ACE scores lead to risky sexual behaviors, earlier sex. I can vouch for that in terms of the children we've worked with at the Baby Fold. A higher rate of teen pregnancy, unintended pregnancies. The biggest correlation from this study, high ACE scores really correlated strongly with depression. And this actually was the most significant risk of high ACE scores in regards to a mental health problem. And with depression comes increased suicide attempts. Treatment overall is not as effective, at least what they saw from the participants of the study who had high ACE scores. In regards to relationships and being victimized in relationships, what they found from their study participants over the course of 2+ decades is a worse quality of relationships overall with high ACE scores, a lot of instability in relationships with high ACE scores, and much greater chance of re-victimization or engaging in domestic violence. In regards to the domain of work and being productive at work, overall higher ACE scores led to poorer performance in the workforce and more work days missed. And kind of the heart and soul of the ACE study was looking at these physical problems with a lot of childhood trauma. What they saw down the road long-term in adulthood is a lot of physical problems like heart disease, chronic lung disease, liver disease, more likelihood of miscarriage and obesity. And the last bullet point you'll see on this slide, the life expectancy, and this one kind of is an eye-opener for folks. What they found long-term with those ACE participants who had ACE scores of 6 or more, life expectancy is around 20 years shorter. So instead of that living to an average of 79 years old, what they're finding in many of these adults who had 6 or more as an ACE score is that 59 becomes the average, a 20-year difference, and that's huge. Now, whenever I deliver this training, I'm always very aware that there are people in the audience who probably have an ACE score of 6 or more from their childhood. That does not mean that anyone is going to die, that you are going to die at the age of 59. And so I want to temper that. I don't want anyone leaving this training with any more anxiety than you came in the training with. It really has a lot to do, this life expectancy, it has a lot to do with how we manage our trauma. If you look at the physical problems, the heart disease, lung disease, liver disease, oftentimes those diseases are exacerbated by drinking alcohol, using drugs, smoking cigarettes. Obviously, if we do engage in those behaviors as a way to moderate our trauma, as a way to cope, we are going to be at more risk for heart disease, lung disease, and liver disease in particular. And that's what one of the many things the ACE study showed as well. And so here are some risks. This slide just gives us a sense of risks. Risks of people with 4 or more ACEs as an ACE score versus 0 ACEs in our childhood. Well, if you've got 4 or more ACEs, it increases the risk of attempted suicide by 1,200%. It increases the risk of alcoholism by 700%. And as you can see, I mentioned earlier sex, 7 times more likely to have sex by the age of 15 with 4 or more as an ACE score. And so again, to me, these statistics, these outcomes, these risk factors are huge when we're trying to understand some of these other impacts from a lot of childhood trauma. And what the ACE study talks about, and what you see in this chart, is essentially this dose-response relationship. On the left-hand side, you have percent of population with health problems, percent of the ACE study population with health problems. And as you can see, the participants who had 0 ACEs, the percent of health problems is somewhere around 5%. By the time you get to 5+ ACEs, the percent of the population with health problems is up to 55%. And this dose response linear upward path relationship that you see on this graph, it's like a dose response is similar to gas in a car. The more gas you put in your car, the further you're going to be able to go. The more of a trauma dose that you have, the more likelihood that you're going to have some physical health problems as a result. And so I like this pyramid image because, again, it kind of ties a bow on what I've just been talking about. Many of us, if we would take the 10-question ACE survey, we would find that we have some adverse childhood experiences. And maybe if it's not the 10 that are on the ACE survey, we may be able to relate to other traumas that we experienced in childhood. And these adverse childhood experiences can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. Trauma impacts how we respond, it impacts how the brain develops, and there could be some impairment. And because of that social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, some of us adopt health risk behaviors to cope with trauma. And I mentioned that earlier: smoking, drinking, using drugs, those health risk behaviors. And when we adopt those health risk behaviors, not surprisingly, we see an increase in disease, we see an increase in disability and social problems, and for many, early death. It's interesting, I want to mention a little bit about some newer thinking on ACEs. There's a lot of kind of mini ACE studies happening since this original ACE study. I encourage folks to check out ACE Philadelphia. Philadelphia ACEs project is quite intriguing because they're looking at trauma and adversity outside the home. I know in particular the Philadelphia ACEs were looking at poverty. They were looking at community violence in the community that these kids grew up in, whether it's unsafe, whether they're even able to meet their basic needs. So again, when we think of those 10 household ACEs that the original ACE study looked at, we really, to understand ACEs and trauma in childhood, we have to understand that racism is a trauma. Me as a white male in this society, I don't have to wake up every morning and stress or be fearful about the color of my skin or my gender. I also know that if you are Black or a person of color or an indigenous person in this country, when you wake up, you have to deal with dual identities. You have to deal with the reality of your color, Black, brown, somewhere in between. And you have to, because of the world we live in, as a person of color, you also have to navigate a white world. And as we've seen very, very clearly, there is a level of trauma in people of color that I, as a white person, will never be able to experience, but I can certainly empathize with. We need to look at communities where kiddos and children are witnessing a lot of violence. They're living in unsafe neighborhoods. Living in foster care, even one placement in a foster home is, to me, a huge big T trauma. And I spent 8 years working in residential care, and many of the kids during that 8 years were involved in 8 to 10 to 12 different foster care placements because of their difficult behaviors. But 8 to 12 different displacements from foster care going to a new foster home, that's a huge trauma on children. And as mentioned before, kids who are bullied, that's a trauma they're dealing with every day, kind of shaking their world. And so when I think of ACEs, the ACE study was great for showing us household traumas. I think a lot of newer ACE studies are focused on the community aspects, resources, lack of resources, racism, which is so important as well. And I like this particular slide because it shows us 3 different realms of ACEs and trauma. Household being the first one, and those are the ones that really the ACE study looked at, those 10 household traumas. But significant traumas can occur from the environment, as we well know, whether it's natural disasters and more with climate crisis that are causing even more natural disasters and worse natural disasters. But below the tree on this slide, you see the community realm of ACEs. Lack of jobs, substandard wages, poverty, community violence, substandard schools, historical trauma, structural racism that's embedded. So I think this really gives a great look at not just the 10 household traumas that the ACE study looked at, but a lot more that are impacting all of us. The conclusions of the ACE study, according to Dr. Robert Anda, the ACE score appears to be a robust indicator of the cumulative lifetime impact of traumatic stress on neurodevelopment and childhood. Stressful and traumatic childhood and adolescent experiences literally become biology, affecting brain structure and function, as well as endocrine, immune, and other biological functions, thus leading to persistent effects. I want to share with you and kind of circle back around in some of the thinking that I've had with the ACE study over time. I think it also helps us to know the demographics a little bit of the 17,000 participants who participated in the ACE study. I think it's first of all important to know, and if you're hearing about the ACE study for the first time, these 17,000 participants all had health insurance. So that says something about their socioeconomic status right off the cuff. To me, what that says is, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought, but I will get back on that. The demographic all had health insurance. To me, socioeconomically, we're looking at some middle-class folks. And so you're leaving out a lot of folks who are lower on the socioeconomic ladder. They don't have health insurance. They weren't counted in this study. 70% of the participants in this study had a college degree, so they're college educated. The majority of the participants in this study were white. So again, in terms of a wide kind of racial swath, we didn't see that. And again, this holds with what's true for the numbers in health insurance. Who has health insurance? Predominantly white folks, middle class folks. So to me, this is interesting if we look at the demographics of these 17,000, because predominantly what they're looking at is middle class white America. And what this says is that middle class white America has a ton of trauma. And if middle class white America has a ton of trauma, I can only imagine what non-middle class, lower socioeconomic statuses, and people of color are impacted by trauma in terms of the levels they may be. So yes, the ACE study was focused primarily on those that had health insurance, those in the middle class, whites, but I think the outcome makes it even more powerful to me. Because again, if this is middle class white America, we've got a lot of work to do in other realms. And it just makes me appreciate the other Americas and how traumatized they are. I do want to mention very important piece here. ACEs are not destiny. Just because you have an ACE score of 6 or more doesn't mean you're going to die at age 59. And I mentioned that earlier. I want to reiterate that as I bring this training to a close, this presentation, and just remind us that ACEs are not destiny. We do have some control, even if our ACE scores were high. It helps when we think of resilience, the ability to bounce back from stressful or traumatic experiences. Having resilient parents and caregivers really help buffer the impacts of a lot of trauma in childhood. It's huge, ameliorating factor. Having loving, nurturing caregivers and parents can be huge. I mentioned early on in the training, the #1 buffer to any traumatic experience is relationships and social connection. So building attachment and nurturing relationships, being involved in nurturing relationships can again buffer the impact of a high ACE score. Staying socially connected, even amidst COVID and kind of the obvious alterations in personal and interpersonal contact, it's still important to remain connected socially as best as we can. It's so important to meet our basic needs: food, clothing, heat, place to live. Because if we can't meet our basic needs, we can't rise above that. Because our energy, our time is consumed, rightfully so, with feeding ourselves, finding a warm place to live. Those become the priority. So we need to meet basic needs first. I think for any caregivers, for any parents, we need to learn about parenting. We need to learn about how children grow. I encourage folks, learn a little bit about how the brain grows and how trauma impacts the brain negatively, certainly in childhood. And we can all build social and emotional skills, especially in children who've been traumatized. A lot of what they need are social and emotional skill building, but they also need a foundation of relationship and safe relationships in order to build resiliency. And when I think of trauma-informed care, I view trauma-informed care as an umbrella approach that once we understand ACEs, once we understand the impact of trauma in childhood, these 3 principles become overarching and so important. So if you think of yourself in your home or bringing some of this information back to a workplace, we need to always be focusing on these 3 components in relation to working with children who've been traumatized or working with families who've experienced a lot of trauma. We have to create a safe environment, both physically and emotionally. we have to focus our efforts on building relationships and staying connected. And we have to be committed to supporting and teaching emotional regulation, skill sets, social and emotional skills to these children who've been impacted by trauma. And at this point, I just want to note that if there is follow-up afterwards, I've left my email here, or questions that go beyond the question format of this particular presentation, don't hesitate to shoot me an email and let me know what that question is. I will certainly get back to you folks. And I've also left some references and some websites and some good videos that you can also tune into if you are so inclined. And so at that point, I guess I'm going to open it up and hope that I still have help at some point.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, at this time, if you want to go ahead and ask some questions for Keith over there to the side under either the chat or the question panel, either one will do. We'll take a couple of minutes for you guys to go ahead and get those in. Looks like Keith has also provided his email for you, especially if you're watching this on YouTube. You can probably still continue to reach out to Keith, but if you have any trouble getting a hold of him, please use the email that we have provided for McLean County as well. At this time, I'd also like to link the McLean County Behavioral Health events page for future upcoming sessions for the forum, as well as our YouTube page, so that you can view all past sessions, including this one you have seen here today with Keith. All right, hold on. All right, so I have one question from Shaki Jones. It says, how old do you have to be to take an ACEs test?
Interesting. That's a great question. And I've had that question before. It really is meant, you can take it at any age, but it really is meant to be taken at, for instance, age 19, because the 10 questions ask you about your experiences up to the age of 18. So again, if you're 14 and you take the ACE, it can still be a very valuable tool. But you have another 4 years where that score may change. So I guess in answering that question, you can take it at any age, but for the ACE score, you really need the full time between birth and 18 years of age, if that makes sense.
Okay. I actually had a question myself, just regarding, and I know you touched on this a little bit, trauma regarding COVID-19, and just trying to get a feel for what kind of traumatic events do you think are increasing, decreasing, and what potential future considerations we might have to make for individuals during this time period down the road when giving an assessment?
Oh, good grief. That's a broad question. No, it's a great question. I think, and we have to put this in perspective too, I'm a firm believer that what we've been experiencing in relation to the shared world trauma of COVID-19, one thing that I did not talk about in this presentation was epigenetics and the impact of trauma on epigenetics. And for those that aren't familiar, let me just briefly give you an example of what epigenetics is. Basically, it's changing how our genes, G-E-N-E-S, are altered by the environment. I'll give you an example. I'm going to use the Dutch famine in the early 40s during World War II. Part of that is because I've got Dutch background, so I'm always curious epigenetically, how much was I impacted physiologically by the famine that was occurring. And for those that aren't familiar, the Dutch were going through a tremendous famine in 1940-41. And then, to make things worse, the Nazis came in and occupied. So as you can imagine, the famine got worse. Being able to attain food got worse. There were some researchers who followed and did some research on women who were pregnant during this Dutch famine. And then, of course, they looked at the babies after they were born, looking for differences. How would would being born in this kind of trauma of famine impact the next generations? And what they found was quite astounding. The metabolisms of newborn children were quite altered. Physical issues like diabetes were quite prevalent. In some cases, the metabolisms of the children that were born were really, really low. And if you think about it, that is a survival mechanism, because if they're being born into a world with not a lot of food, it's better to have a very slow metabolism. So these were fascinating changes in physiology that came out of an environmental trauma. And so with that being said, I'm very curious what 5 or 10 years from now we're going to find out about some epigenetic changes as a result of COVID-19 and us all being impacted by the stress for the past 11 months in some way, shape, or form. The biggest thing I can say in regards to, we've been saying it a lot at the Baby Fold, we need to give each other grace. We need to understand we have all been impacted negatively in some way over the course of this shared world trauma. And if the fact that over 500,000 people and rising of Americans have lost their lives in the past 11 months doesn't bring you to your knees, I don't know what will, in regards to understanding the horrific costs, the grief, and the stress. And it'll be interesting to see 10 years from now. I'm sure there'll be research studies out there looking at our physiology. I'm sure there will be researchers looking at women who were pregnant during COVID-19 and researching how those kiddos have been impacted, who are going to be born or have been born during this time. So there's a little bit about thoughts on your question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I know that even though COVID's been terrible, there will be a lot of interesting things to come out of it. Speaking of studies, I have one specific question on the ACEs study from Laura Holland. She wants to know, does the study give the data on the length of exposure to the trauma versus the effects that are mentioned that occur from it?
It does not go into length of exposure. Again, the wording on the 10-question survey is, they ask about frequency. But they didn't specifically go into length of exposure. And that's so different in all of these cases. And it's hard to equate across all. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. I found that one anecdote about the participants having health insurance to be very interesting. That's actually something that I hadn't heard in all of the times I've heard about this study, and that's some pretty telling information. I have one last participant who is asking for access to the PowerPoint that you used today. Would you be able to make that available publicly? You can always send it to me, and then I can post it onto our website.
Absolutely. I will send that to you today, and then you can post it wherever you want to. That'd be great.
Terrific. Okay, that looks like all of the questions we have today. Again, for our participants, I provided links to both our website for future presentations, and I also have our YouTube page linked in there, so you can rewatch this one or share it to anyone who you think might be interested. I want to thank Keith one more time for being with us today. Thank you very much to everyone who is viewing today. Be safe out there. It's extremely cold, so make sure you're bundled up. And thanks again. We hope to see you at the next one.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.